Continuing our journey on The Rise the Limit, we move from serene temples to a site of profound historical weight in Chapter 16, Blood, Pixels and Pine, a Shogun's Tale. Our traveller confronts the violent legacy of a samurai's sacrifice preserved in a ceiling stained with blood before navigating the clash between ancient and modern Japan. Join us as an exploration of a shogun's pivotal moment and a video game company's origins shows how a traveller's luck can abruptly run out. Blood, Pixels and Pine, a Shogun's Tale. Ancient pine stands guard, bloodstains mark ceiling above. Pixels end the quest. A serene garden watched over by a bloody ceiling. Following our tour of Arashiyama's eccentrics, both sculpted and living, I had my sights set on a place we'd missed on our last trip to Kyoto. There was an unfinished bit of business at a temple called Hōsen-in, a place known for two things: a 700-year-old pine tree and a ceiling decorated with the 400-year-old blood of samurai. My kind of place. Our taxi pulled up near the entrance, and a woman instantly appeared out of the ether to assault the driver. She was tiny, ancient, and possessed a fury that could power a small city. She hammered on his window, yelling with the conviction of someone who has just seen you run over their prize-winning bonsai. From my vantage point, the driver's only crime was existing in her general vicinity. But this geriatric ronin was having none of it. She was clearly a direct descendant of a shogun, now dedicating her retirement to defending her 3-foot patch of curb. He drove off. We walked. After that curbside exorcism, the path to the temple felt like entering another dimension. It was quiet, green, and a tiny tree frog hopped out to greet us, possibly to assure us that not all locals were poised to declare war on our transportation. Inside, we were led to a tatami room for a small tea ceremony. We knelt, sipped bitter matcha, and ate a small, sweet confection made of bean paste. It was all very serene, very proper. This room is famous for its picture frame garden, where the pillars of the building frame a perfect living painting of the outdoors. The undisputed star of this show is a massive 5-leaf pine, its branches trained over centuries to mimic the shape of Mount Fuji. It's the kind of meticulous, perfect pine piece you can only achieve with 700 years of dedicated gardening. You sit there, you sip your tea, you admire the scenery, and you feel a deep, meditative calm settle over you. Then you look up. The ceiling is made from the floorboards of Fushimi Castle. In the year 1600, the castle's commander, Tori Mototada, was ordered by his boss, the soon-to-be shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, to hold the fort at all costs. It was a delaying tactic, a strategic sacrifice, and Mototada was a company man. He and his 380 soldiers fought until the situation was hopeless. Then, rather than surrender, they all committed ritual suicide on the castle floor. The faint, rust-colored stains on the planks above our heads were the result. To honor their loyalty and pacify their spirits, the bloody floorboards were salvaged and installed as ceilings in several Kyoto temples. If you stare long enough, your brain starts playing connect the dots with the shadowy blotches, looking for a handprint or the outline of a fallen man. Mototada's family, for their part, did very well out of his sacrifice, becoming one of Japan's most important for the next 2.5 centuries. His lethal loyalty paid dividends. There is a unique lesson in sitting in a beautiful room, sipping tea while admiring a perfect garden, all under the silent gaze of a 400-year-old mass suicide. I seem to be drawn to these places, where the past isn't just a story in a book, but a literal stain on the ceiling. It's one thing to read about history. It's another thing entirely to have it drip on you. Sword and State. The Shogun's 7th-century supremacy. That blood-stained ceiling at Hōsen-in was more than a grim historical artifact. It was a receipt. The price was 380 lives. The purchase was a future for a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. This transaction brings up a reasonable question. Who was this Ieyasu, and how does one man's agenda get an entire castle garrison to commit suicide as a strategic delay? To answer that, you have to understand the job title he was aiming for, Shogun. For nearly 700 years, Japan ran on a strange two-for-one deal when it came to rulers. You had the emperor in Kyoto, a divine sovereign from an unbroken line, a living god, and the ultimate head of state. You also had the shogun, a military dictator who was, for all practical purposes, the guy actually running the country. The emperor had the sacred title and the palace stationery. The shogun had the army, collected the taxes, and made the laws. It was the political equivalent of one person owning the restaurant while another person hired the staff, wrote the menu, and kept all the money. The shogun's government was called the bakufu, which translates to tent office. This wasn't some poetic metaphor for a flexible administration. It was a literal nod to ruling from a military field headquarters, an image that suggests less mahogany and marble and more canvas, flaps, and muddy boots. This tent-based bureaucracy first camped out in a city called Kamakura, then later moved to Kyoto and finally settled in Edo, which we now call Tokyo. The whole enterprise kicked off with the Kamakura shogunate in 1192. Its founder, Minamoto no Yoritomo, had just won a nasty civil war and understood that the imperial court in Kyoto was a viper pit of elegant manners and backroom dealings. He established his government in Kamakura far away to keep his warriors from getting soft. To make sure the emperor didn't get any bright ideas, he set up a branch office in Kyoto called the Rokuhara Tandai, a menacingly efficient agency that was part governor's office, part Supreme Court, and part secret police. It was as if the DMV also handled espionage and federal sentencing. When one emperor did, in fact, get a bright idea and rebelled, the Rokuhara Tandai crushed him so quickly it was embarrassing. After the Kamakura crew came the Ashikaga shogunate, who decided against remote work and plopped their headquarters right down in Kyoto's Muromachi district. This proximity to the imperial drama they were supposed to be avoiding went about as well as you'd expect. Their authority eventually crumbled, kicking off a century-long nationwide bar fight known as the Sengoku period. This brings us back to Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man whose ambitions were literally written in blood on the ceiling above my head. He was the founder of the third and final act, the Tokugawa shogunate. After winning a battle so decisive it basically ended all other battles, he created a government that would last over 250 years. He was a master of control, forcing regional lords into a system of alternate attendance, where they had to spend every other year in his capital, their families remaining behind as well-kept hostages. He expertly eliminated his final rival, the Toyotomi clan, by picking a fight over the inscription on a temple bell, which is perhaps the most passive-aggressive pretext for war in human history. The irony is that the man he supplanted, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had unified the country but couldn't be shogun himself. The reason? He was born a peasant. He could conquer a nation, but he couldn't get past the ultimate cosmic bouncer checking aristocratic bloodlines at the door. The shogun's 700-year run as Japan's supreme military contractor finally ended in 1868. The last Tokugawa shogun abdicated, and power was officially restored to the emperor, launching the country into the modern age. Deliberative assemblies shall be widely established and all matters decided by public discussion. All classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall each be allowed to pursue his own calling so that there may be no discontent. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off, and everything based upon the just laws of nature. Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule. The Charter Oath, 1868. Swords and Shoguns, the savage struggle for sovereignty. We left off with the shogunate, that peculiar institution where an emperor reigned but a military dictator ruled. To understand how that final lasting shogunate came to be, you first have to appreciate the absolute mess it emerged from. Picture Japan in the 16th century, not as a serene land of temples and gardens, but as a nationwide cage match with 100 ambitious warlords clawing for supremacy. Unifying this beautiful disaster was a job for three very different, very ambitious men. Their personalities are captured perfectly in a little poem about a cuckoo that won't sing. The first guy, Oda Nobunaga, said, "If it doesn't sing, kill it." A management philosophy that would get you fired today, but it was brutally effective then. Nobunaga was the demolisher, the human bulldozer who shattered the old feudal system. His personal motto wasn't live, laugh, love, but rule the realm by military force, which he had embroidered on all his flags. He was a revolutionary who saw the value in European firearms when everyone else was still fixated on the romance of the sword. At the Battle of Nagashino, he used his gunners to mow down the most feared cavalry in Japan, proving that progress, in this case, was a volley of lead. He broke the power of militant Buddhist monks by simply burning their monasteries to the ground, yet he was also a great patron of the arts. The man was a complicated mix of tyrant and connoisseur. His violent career came to a sudden, fiery end when his best general, Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him. Trapped in a Kyoto temple, Nobunaga committed seppuku, leaving behind one of history's great unsolved mysteries. Why did Akechi do it? Was it a personal grudge, a political calculation? We'll never know. But it was the ultimate et tu, brute moment of the samurai era. With Nobunaga out of the way, the second man stepped into the spotlight with his own answer to the cuckoo problem. If it doesn't sing, make it sing. This was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, whose life was Japan's greatest rags-to-riches story. He started as Nobunaga's sandal-bearer, the guy who warms up the boss's shoes, and rose to become the most powerful man in the country through sheer cleverness and energy. When he heard Nobunaga was dead, he didn't mourn. He moved. He defeated the traitor Akechi in a flash, positioning himself as the loyal avenger and seizing control. Where Nobunaga bulldozed, Hideyoshi built. He completed the unification through shrewd deals and a few decisive battles. He then launched a sword hunt, confiscating all weapons from the peasantry. The official story was that the metal was needed to build a giant statue of Buddha. It was a masterful bit of political spin, disarm any potential rebels while appearing pious. His final years, however, were a mess of paranoia and a disastrous attempt to invade Korea twice. He died leaving a 5-year-old son as his heir, which in feudal Japan was like leaving a lamb chop in a wolf den. This brings us to the third man, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and his solution for the stubborn bird. If the cuckoo doesn't sing, wait for it to sing. Ieyasu was the ultimate survivor, a man whose patience was a strategic weapon. While Nobunaga was smashing things and Hideyoshi was charming and conquering, Ieyasu was quietly building his power base in the east. After Hideyoshi's death, the inevitable power struggle began, and Ieyasu was ready. At the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, a colossal clash involving over 160,000 soldiers, he crushed the forces loyal to Hideyoshi's young son. The victory came, in part, because he convinced a key enemy general to switch sides mid-battle. A few years later, he was appointed Shogun, establishing a dynasty that would rule for 250 years. standing under a blood-stained ceiling from the siege of Fushimi Castle, where one of Ieyasu's loyal vassals and 380 of his men had committed seppuku rather than surrender. I was reminded of the sheer brutality of his final consolidation of power. He eliminated the last of the Toyotomi loyalists at the siege of Osaka, picking a fight over the inscription on a temple bell, which he claimed was a curse against him. It was the 17th century equivalent of starting a war over a passive-aggressive text message. You might argue that Hideyoshi, the man who actually finished the unification, deserved the top job, but he couldn't become shogun. He was born a peasant, and the title demanded a noble bloodline. Ieyasu, with his patience and impeccable ancestry, was the one who could finally bring the cuckoo to heel, not by killing it or forcing it, but by creating a cage so perfectly constructed, so stable and inescapable, that the bird had no choice but to sing for the next 2.5 centuries. Crimson Crest, the clamour of a coming king. Right, my son said as we sipped tea listening to his father's lecture. So Oda Nobunaga was the kill the cuckoo guy we talked about. The very one, I confirmed. Brutal, ambitious, and not known for his patience with uncooperative birds. Before he could follow up, I added, but to carry out his plan of unifying the realm by military force, he needed a new toy. And that part of the story, believe it or not, starts with a shipwreck. In 1543, a Chinese ship with a few Portuguese adventurers aboard got hopelessly lost and washed up on Tanegashima, a small island south of the main Japanese archipelago. Getting blown off course was rarely a good thing, but this may have been the most consequential navigational error in history. The local lord, Tanegashima Tokitaka, was less concerned with their plight and more interested in the long, loud sticks they carried. He bought 2 matchlock muskets on the spot and then gave his master swordsmiths a simple, terrifying challenge. Copy them. This is often the point in the story where a nation's craftsmen spend a century fumbling with crude imitations. The Japanese, however, are not most people. Not only did they reverse engineer the gun's complicated firing mechanism, but within a decade they were churning out muskets that were, in many respects, better than the European originals. They had taken someone else's homework, corrected it, and were now acing the test. These new weapons, called Tanegashima after the island of their accidental birth, spread across the warring states and changed everything. Samurai warfare, once a matter of heroic duels between well-bred warriors, was about to become an impersonal, ugly business of peasant foot soldiers firing in disciplined rows. And no one understood the ugly business of war better than Oda Nobunaga. He was a pure pragmatist in an age of poetry and honor. He saw the Jesuits show up and didn't see a theological challenge. He saw a pipeline. He knew that a friendly attitude toward the missionaries meant a steady supply of European armor, goods, and, most importantly, guns. He also correctly guessed that having them around would be a fantastic way to irritate the powerful Buddhist monasteries that stood in his way. In 1567 he conquered a key province, took over a castle on a mountain, and renamed the town at its base Gifu, a nod to an ancient Chinese capital that launched a unification campaign. It was the 16th century equivalent of putting up a billboard that says, "Under new management, and I own everything." He used to say, "He who controls Gifu controls Japan," and from his fortress atop Mount Kinka, it was easy to believe him. He wasn't all bad news. The man who gave us the Demon King nickname also took the ancient art of cormorant fishing under his protection, using it to entertain guests. It's a strange contradiction, like finding out Genghis Khan was a passionate stamp collector. But the Demon King moniker wasn't for nothing. In 1571, annoyed by the resistance from the monks on Mount Hiei, he besieged their monastery complex, burned the whole thing to the ground, and killed thousands. 4 years later, at the Battle of Nagashino, he put his theories to the ultimate test. He faced the legendary cavalry of the Takeda clan, the most feared horsemen in Japan. Nobunaga didn't meet them with his own samurai. He met them with thousands of peasant infantry armed with his improved muskets, hiding behind cheap wooden fences. The Takeda cavalry charged, expecting glory. They got volleys of coordinated musket fire instead. The age of the heroic warrior charging into battle was over, replaced by the grim mathematics of lead and gunpowder. It was not an entirely noble transition. Nobunaga's court was the center of this new, violent, and surprisingly cosmopolitan Japan. And in 1581, a man walked into it who was perhaps the most astonishing sight anyone there had ever seen. He was a servant to an Italian Jesuit named Alessandro Valignano, and he was from Africa. His name was Yasuke. Standing over 6 feet tall, he towered over the Japanese. Nobunaga was so stunned by his appearance that he reportedly had Yasuke stripped and scrubbed, convinced his dark skin was merely ink. Once satisfied that Yasuke was in fact real, Nobunaga was captivated. In a move that was simply unheard of, he took the man from the Jesuits, freed him, and made him a samurai. Yasuke was granted a residence, a stipend, and the right to carry a sword. He became Nobunaga's personal weapon-bearer and bodyguard, even dining with him, a privilege reserved for the highest elite. At the same time, another man was making his way through Nobunaga's ranks. He had started as a sandal-bearer, a servant whose only job was to carry his master's footwear. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Watching the rise of demon kings and African samurai, he was a man whose own incredible story was just beginning. It seems he was not entirely content with a career in footwear. Kyoto's killing, the curious crime of a close confidant. Having followed the story of Japan's great unifiers, from Gifu Castle to the battlefields, it felt like we were tracking a storm. Oda Nobunaga was the lightning, the force that cracked the old world open. We'd seen his ambition in stone and heard of his ruthlessness on the battlefield. The next stop on this historical scavenger hunt was Kyoto, but we weren't looking for a castle or a monastery. We were looking for the place the storm finally broke. The site of Honnoji Temple today is spectacularly unspectacular, a stone marker tucked away in a downtown district of office buildings and convenience stores. It's the historical equivalent of a sign that says, "Something important happened here, please do not block driveway." It was here, in June of 1582, that Oda Nobunaga, a man on the very brink of conquering all of Japan, decided to take a little breather. He was chilling out with what amounted to a security detail of a few dozen men. It was a staggering lapse in judgment, like a lion tamer taking a nap inside the cage. This vulnerability was exploited by the one man he supposedly trusted most, his general, Akechi Mitsuhide. This wasn't some brutish thug. Akechi was cultured, proven, and a senior commander. He was on a mission elsewhere when he suddenly informed his troops of a change in plans. It's the ultimate "the enemy is at Honnoji" moment, except he was the enemy. He surrounded the temple and attacked his own boss. Trapped, Nobunaga did the only thing a cornered warlord could do. As the temple burned around him, he committed seppuku, ending his violent career with a self-inflicted, violent flourish. And, just like that, the most powerful man in Japan was gone. The question that has kept historians, playwrights, and video game developers busy for over 400 years is, why? It's the great unsolved mystery of samurai history. One theory is that it was a simple grudge. Nobunaga was notoriously harsh, and his insults could peel paint. For a samurai whose entire identity was tied to honor, public humiliation was a debt that could only be paid in blood. This was the ultimate "I quit, and you're coming with me" email. A more charitable view casts Akechi as a patriot. Rumors were flying that Nobunaga, having crushed every opponent, was getting a bit of a god complex. The next logical step in his megalomania was to depose the emperor and maybe declare himself a living deity. In this light, Akechi's betrayal was a desperate act to save the soul of Japan from a tyrant. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that a familiar face was there that night. Yasuke, the African samurai who had become Nobunaga's personal retainer, fought beside the defenders. After the temple fell, he escaped and joined Nobunaga's son for a last stand at a nearby castle. He was eventually captured. When brought before Akechi, the new boss apparently had no idea what to do with him. It's an absurd bureaucratic snag in the middle of a coup d'etat. Having successfully overthrown the government, Akechi's first administrative problem was a 6-foot-tall foreigner for whom there was no protocol. He punted, handing Yasuke over to the Jesuits, and history lost his trail. Temple burns bright. The Demon King's dream is ash. A new lord rises. Swift succession, from a retainer's race to a regent's reign. He who has the goodwill of the people has nothing to fear from conspiracies. Niccolo Machiavelli. That blood-stained ceiling at Hōsen-in came from Fushimi Castle, a place built by the man who benefited most from Oda Nobunaga's assassination. Thinking about those dark planks, it's hard not to trace the story back to what happened right after Nobunaga's fiery end at the temple. The man who lit the match, Akechi Mitsuhide, discovered that being a successful traitor and a successful ruler are two very different skill sets. His moment on top lasted about 13 days, a reign so short it barely qualifies as a historical footnote, more like a historical post-it note. After his shocking betrayal, Akechi failed to get anyone important to join his cause. He was like a man who stages a corporate coup and then realizes he forgot to tell anyone else at the company. The other major samurai lords, seeing the news, either remained loyal to Nobunaga's memory or, more likely, adopted the universally prudent strategy of waiting to see who would throw the biggest punch. That punch came from Toyotomi Hideyoshi. When word of his master's death reached him, Hideyoshi was busy besieging a castle far to the west. His response was a masterclass in opportunism. He didn't grieve. He acted. He instantly signed a peace treaty with his enemy, probably on the back of a napkin, and then spun his entire army around. He initiated the Chugoku Ogaeshi, the Great Return, a forced march back to Kyoto at a pace that defied logic and human endurance. His army moved like a single, mud-caked serpent, devouring the miles with a speed that suggested the invention of caffeine several centuries early. This incredible sprint allowed him to catch Akechi's forces completely off guard at the Battle of Yamazaki. The battle was a decisive crush. Akechi, the great betrayer, ended up fleeing the field only to be killed by a band of peasant bandits, a finale rich with historical irony. It's one thing to be outmaneuvered by a brilliant general. It's another to meet your end at the hands of locals who were probably just looking for spare change and a new pair of sandals. By framing himself as the SWIFT Avenger, Hideyoshi seized control of the narrative, painting himself as the loyal HERO who cleaned up the mess. Hideyoshi, a man who rose from carrying his lord's sandals to ruling all of Japan, eventually died of natural causes in 1598 at Fushimi Castle. For his final act, he devised a succession plan that seemed destined for failure. He named his 5-year-old son, Hideyori, as his heir. To protect the boy, he created a council of Japan's 5 most powerful warlords, made them swear solemn oaths of loyalty, and basically asked them to play nice. On this council of sharks sat one Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful man in the country. Ieyasu, who was not exactly famous for his disinterest in power, took his seat and waited. The patient warlord versus the loyal bureaucrat. My visit to Hōsen-in, with its infamous blood-stained ceiling, had left a mark. Staring up at the dark patterns on those wooden planks, you can't help but wonder about the people behind such a gruesome piece of interior decorating. It wasn't the work of some abstract historical force, it was the direct result of a power struggle between two men, a showdown that was less a simple battle and more the final, explosive episode of Japan's longest-running reality show, Warlord Apprentice. On one side, you had Tokugawa Ieyasu. In the grand tradition of Japanese animal metaphors, he was known as the old tanuki, or raccoon dog, a creature famous for being sly, patient, and possessing disproportionately large, confidence. Ieyasu was the ultimate survivor. He'd spent his childhood as a political bargaining chip, an experience that apparently teaches you patience in a way that building model airplanes never will. By 1600, he was the wealthiest and most powerful lord in the country, sitting in his fortress in Edo, which we now know as Tokyo. He played the long game, famous for being the man who would wait for the cuckoo to sing. Most people would just buy a new cuckoo. Ieyasu would wait, probably using the time to alphabetize his enemies' list and cross-reference their weaknesses. His rival was Ishida Mitsunari, and if Ieyasu was a cunning predator, Mitsunari was a brilliant, high-strung calculating machine. He was not a warrior. He was a numbers guy, a bureaucrat who owed his entire career to the late regent, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, because he was spectacularly good at logistics. Think of him as the guy who could organize a 3-day music festival down to the last portable toilet, but who nobody actually wanted to hang out with. His power came from his intellect and his job title, not from a fearsome army or a vast territory. He was fiercely loyal to his dead boss, but also legendarily rigid and dismissive of the veteran generals, the tough-as-nails warriors who saw him as little more than an officious bean counter with a promotion he didn't deserve. This personality mismatch became a national emergency after Hideyoshi died, leaving his 5-year-old son as heir. Mitsunari, ever the loyal company man, tried to protect the kid's inheritance. He saw Ieyasu making moves to take over the firm and tried to assemble a coalition of lords loyal to the old regime. The problem was, this coalition was about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Many of the key players personally disliked Mitsunari. Ieyasu, being the master politician he was, saw these cracks and started sliding little notes under the door, promising promotions and corner offices to anyone willing to switch sides. Fateful fortitude, a retainer's resolute resistance. As I mentioned, the showdown between the patient old schemer Tokugawa Ieyasu and the rigid administrator Ishida Mitsunari was never going to be solved over a polite cup of tea. It was the kind of high-stakes finale that demanded a grand, violent stage. That stage turned out to be Fushimi Castle, a magnificent palace that had the misfortune of being Japan's unluckiest piece of real estate. The castle was originally the pet project of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man who believed that if you were going to have a retirement home, it should be visible from space. But barely had the lacquer dried when a massive earthquake in 1596 flattened it. Unfazed, Hideyoshi had it rebuilt on a neighboring hill, which is a bit like your house burning down, and deciding to rebuild it using the original, highly flammable blueprints. Shortly after, he died, leaving his shiny, new and apparently cursed castle in Ieyasu's hands. By 1600, Ieyasu knew Mitsunari's massive army was marching his way. He looked at Fushimi Castle standing directly in their path and didn't see a fortress. He saw a speed bump. He needed to buy time for the real fight, so he turned to his most devoted friend, a lifelong vassal named Tori Mototada. Their bond wasn't just professional. They had grown up together as political hostages, sharing a gilded cage where the threat of being a human bargaining chip was a daily special. Ieyasu looked at this man, his oldest friend, and gave him what might be the worst job assignment in military history. The mission wasn't to win, it was to lose, but to do so as slowly and inconveniently as possible. He asked Mototada to be the foundation stone for his victory, a deeply poetic way of asking someone to get slaughtered for the good of the team. How do you even respond to that? Do you ask about the benefits package? Mototada, a man whose loyalty made Labradors look flighty, accepted without hesitation. The night before Ieyasu left, the two old friends shared a final drink, both knowing it was goodbye. So, in late August, Mitsunari's 40,000 soldiers arrived to find the castle defended by Mototada and maybe 2,000 men, though some accounts put the number at a frankly comical 380. That isn't a battle. It's a rounding error. It's like trying to stop an armored division with a aggressively staffed bake sale. For 11 days, they held out against impossible odds until the walls were finally breached and the defense collapsed. With the end certain, Mototada and his surviving men gathered in the main keep and committed seppuku, ritual suicide. Rather than surrender, they died on their own terms, and their blood soaked into the cypress floorboards. The delay was strategically perfect. It gave Ieyasu just enough time to assemble his army and smash Mitsunari's forces at the Battle of Sekigahara, unifying Japan and kicking off a 250-year era of peace under his family's rule. The story should end there. But Ieyasu, ever the pragmatist, was also an innovator in the field of recycling. He had the blood-stained floorboards from Fushimi Castle salvaged, cleaned and repurposed as ceilings in several temples around Kyoto. They are called chitenjo, or blood ceilings, which is how I found myself sipping matcha in the serene garden of Hōsen-in, looking up at the dark, ghostly patterns on the planks above. You can faintly make out the shapes, the dark smear of a greater handprint, the ghostly outline of a fallen warrior, permanently preserved in the wood like a Rorschach test from hell. It's a beautiful, gruesome reminder that peace is often built on a foundation of something else entirely. The soft chime of a wind bell echoed through the garden. But Ieyasu's tribute to his friend wasn't just poetic. He also publicly showered Mototada's son with land and wealth, turning the Tori clan into major players. It was a heartfelt thank you to a dead friend, absolutely. But it was also a brilliant piece of political advertising. The message to every other ambitious samurai clan was crystal clear. This level of devotion to the new boss comes with fantastic rewards. Loyalty, it turned out, paid very, very well. Dying dynasties, the dust of departed days. That kind of astonishing loyalty, the regular kind that makes a man and his entire garrison serve as a human speed bump, wasn't exactly universal. Tori Mototada's bloody sacrifice at Fushimi Castle bought his boss, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the time he needed. But it also forced everyone else in Japan to finally pick a side in the nation's biggest, most consequential feud. The whole thing was about to come to a head in a sleepy little crossroads called Sekigahara, a place that was about to become famous for hosting the most important and perhaps most dysfunctional company offsite in Japanese history. On one side was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the patient, cunning old tanuki who had been quietly accumulating power for decades. On the other was Ishida Mitsunari, a brilliant bureaucrat who was legendarily good with logistics and famously bad with people. Mitsunari was fiercely loyal to the memory of his deceased ruler, but he had the social grace of a tax auditor. He was the kind of man who could organize a 100,000-person army, but couldn't win a friend in a 2-person elevator. This was less a battle between armies and more a clash between a patiently waiting crocodile and an irritable, extremely organized badger. The stage was set on a foggy October morning. Over 160,000 soldiers, armed to the teeth with Japanese-made matchlock muskets, stood waiting in a damp valley. The battle didn't start with heroic cavalry charges. It began with a massive, deafening exchange of gunfire between thousands of foot soldiers, a loud and clear signal that the age of individual samurai duels was officially over. This was warfare, as a grim industrial process. But for all the modern weaponry, the day wasn't decided by who had more guns. It was decided by who had the most treacherous friends. The key to the entire mess was a young man named Kobayakawa Hideaki, who was perched on a strategic hill with his 15,000 troops. He had pledged his loyalty to Mitsunari's Western army, but Ieyasu had been whispering sweet nothings about land and power in his ear. So he just sat there, for hours. As the battle raged below, he and his men watched from their hilltop perch like spectators who couldn't decide which team to bet on. An impatient Ieyasu, seeing the battle stall, finally had enough. He reportedly ordered his riflemen to fire a volley, not at the enemy, but directly at Kobayakawa's position. It was the 17th century equivalent of sending a text that just says, "Well?" It worked. The volley shocked Kobayakawa into making a decision. He ordered his men to charge, not against Ieyasu, but straight into the flank of his own allies. The betrayal was so sudden and total that the Western army simply disintegrated. It was a domino rally of treachery, and Kobayakawa had kicked over the first piece. But not every story from that day was about backstabbing. On the other side of the moral ledger was Otani Yoshitsugu, Ishida Mitsunari's best and only true friend. Yoshitsugu suffered from leprosy, and in an age of superstition, he was an outcast. Yet their bond was solid. At a tea ceremony once, a drop of pus from a sore on Yoshitsugu's face fell into the communal tea bowl. As the other guests recoiled in horror, Mitsunari calmly took the bowl, drank every last drop and declared it delicious, sparing his friend a devastating public humiliation. When war came, Yoshitsugu, though nearly blind from his illness, joined Mitsunari without hesitation. He knew Kobayakawa was a snake, and he strategically placed his small force directly in the traitor's path. When the betrayal came, his men fought with a fury that bordered on the suicidal, a brief heroic stand against the inevitable tide. Defeated, Yoshitsugu committed ritual suicide on the battlefield. In a single day, a century of civil war ended. Ieyasu's victory was absolute. Mitsunari was captured and executed in Kyoto. Kobayakawa got his promised rewards, but died 2 years later at 21, childless and disgraced, an outcome many saw as cosmic justice. Ieyasu, the patient crocodile, had finally snapped up the whole pond, ushering in 250 years of peace under his family's rule. It's a strange paradox of history that a nation's longest period of stability was built not on honor or valor, but on a single perfectly timed act of betrayal prompted by a volley of warning shots. Cunning consolidation, crushing clans for a lasting calm. Winning a war, as I gathered from the story of Sekigahara, is a messy business of betrayal and fog. But mopping up afterward is its own special art form. Tokugawa Ieyasu had won the big game, but one crucial piece remained on the board. The Toyotomi clan, holed up in the formidable Osaka Castle. This wasn't just a loose end, it was the series' finale cliffhanger, a potential rallying point for every disgruntled, unemployed samurai, or ronin in Japan. Ieyasu, a man who planned his lunch with more strategic foresight than most generals plan a campaign, knew he had to eliminate this threat. The problem was, you can't just march up to a castle and tell the previous dynasty's kid to vacate the premises. You need a pretext. In 1614, Ieyasu got the most wonderfully petty pretext in the history of warfare. Toyotomi Hideyori, a young man trying to do a nice thing, sponsored a giant bronze bell for a temple. On it was an inscription. Ieyasu's scholars, who must have been a real treat at dinner parties, examined the calligraphy and declared it an act of treason. One phrase, which innocently wished for peace and prosperity, contained the characters of Ieyasu's name separated from each other. This, the scholars breathlessly reported, was clearly a symbolic prayer for his dismemberment. It was the 17th century equivalent of being unfriended on social media, except instead of a sad notification, it came with a 200,000-man army. With this flimsy justification in hand, Ieyasu launched the winter campaign. He besieged Osaka Castle, but it was a beast of a fortress, made even tougher by the legendary samurai Sanada Yukimura. Yukimura built a defensive outcropping so effective that the Tokugawa army basically kept running into a brick wall. Frustrated, Ieyasu switched from swords to psychology and started lobbing cannonballs into the castle. When one came a little too close to the living quarters of Hideyori's mother, she promptly convinced her son to sue for peace. Ieyasu's terms seemed generous. He would spare them if they dismantled the castle's defenses. The Toyotomi naively agreed and filled in their outer moat. Ieyasu's men, offering to help, then proceeded to fill in the inner moat as well, effectively leaving the castle as defensible as a sandcastle in a tsunami. The crackle of flames must have been the first sound that registered once the fighting stopped. By the spring of 1615, the Toyotomi realized they'd been had, and decided their only option was to fight. Ieyasu, declaring the treaty broken, returned for the summer campaign. The climax was a furious battle where Sanada Yukimura, in a final glorious charge, broke through the Tokugawa lines and came so close to Ieyasu that the future ruler had to personally flee. But it was a doomed effort. Yukimura was killed, and the Toyotomi forces collapsed. The Tokugawa army stormed the now defenseless castle. As the fortress burned, Hideyori and his mother committed ritual suicide, and the Toyotomi name was erased. It was the brutal, bloody exclamation point on a century of war, and after the smoke cleared, Japan would have peace for the next 250 years. Shogun's shadow, suppression and survival of a sacred sect. It turns out that winning a civil war is the easy part. The hard part is managing the peace, which mostly involves making sure no one else can use the same destabilizing tactics you did to get to the top. After Ieyasu Tokugawa cleaned house, he found Japan wrestling with two dangerously new products, European guns and European ideas. He was a big fan of the first, but the second, specifically Christianity, was starting to give him a serious headache. The whole thing started innocently enough in 1549, when Jesuit missionaries arrived. Their boss in Asia, a sharp operator named Alessandro Valignano, gave them a simple directive. When in Japan, do as the Japanese do. His priests learned the language, mastered the etiquette, and generally avoided acting like loud tourists. This approach worked wonders. They were a hit, especially with the warlord Oda Nobunaga, who was in the middle of his own aggressive corporate takeover of the country. Nobunaga saw the Jesuits as a perfect tool. They were a useful counter to his main rivals, super-wealthy Buddhist monasteries, and they were the exclusive distributors of the hottest new tech, Portuguese firearms. He also just liked talking to them, grilling them for hours about European science and geography like he was cramming for a cosmic final exam. This cozy period got the label Christian Century, which, looking back, seems wildly optimistic. After Ieyasu Tokugawa finally unified the country, the official attitude towards Christianity did a complete 180. The Tokugawa government saw the faith not as a curiosity, but as a clear and present danger to its new, fragile stability. Their logic was simple. First, Christians pledged ultimate loyalty to God, which directly conflicted with the job requirement of pledging ultimate loyalty to your local lord and the shogun. You can't have two bosses, especially when one is invisible and has a much better benefits package. Second, they saw how Spanish and Portuguese priests often acted as the advance team for colonial invasions, and the shogun had no interest in Japan becoming a footnote in European history. Finally, the Christian idea that everyone was equal in the eyes of God was poison to the rigid, hierarchical social structure the Tokugawas were carefully constructing. So, the shogunate banned the religion. Missionaries were kicked out, and Japanese Christians, the Kirishitan, were ordered to renounce their faith. To enforce this, they invented one of history's most psychologically brutal loyalty tests, the Fumi-e, or stepping-on picture. These were bronze plaques with an image of Jesus or Mary. Once a year, everyone in a suspected Christian area had to line up and publicly step on one. Any hesitation, any flicker of reverence meant you were a believer. This led to arrest, torture, and if you still refused to give up your faith, a gruesome death. It was bureaucratic evil at its most efficient. I can only imagine the local official thinking, "Okay, Tanaka-san, good firm step. Suzuki-san, you paused for a second. There, I'm watching you." Kato-san just tripped and landed face first on the plaque. I'm not sure how to score that one. This policy of systematic pressure finally blew up in 1637 with the Shimabara Rebellion. It was less a holy war and more a massive peasant uprising fueled by crushing taxes and brutal persecution. The rebels, a mix of desperate farmers and unemployed samurai, rallied around a charismatic teenager named Amakusa Shiro, who they believed was a messiah. They holed up in an old castle, raised Christian banners, and defied the full might of the state. The shogunate, viewing this as an existential threat, sent a gargantuan army to crush them. In a move of supreme cynical cooperation, they even got help from Dutch traders who were eager to prove they were the good kind of foreigner by using their ships' cannons to bombard the castle full of Catholics. After a long siege, the castle fell. The result was a massacre of some 37,000 people. The shogun had made his point. The rebellion convinced the government that any foreign influence was simply too risky, and it slammed the door shut, beginning over 2 centuries of near-total isolation. But the story doesn't end there. Despite the executions and the annual blasphemy tests, some communities kept the faith alive in secret. For generations, these hidden Christians practiced an amazing blend of belief, disguising the Virgin Mary as the Buddhist goddess Kannon, and chanting prayers that sounded like Buddhist sutras, but were actually garbled mixes of Latin, Portuguese, and Japanese. When Japan reopened to the world 2 centuries later, French missionaries were stunned to find these communities emerging from the shadows, their faith preserved against all odds. To survive, they had hidden their faith from the world. When they were discovered, their survival was the very proof of that faith. Warriors wane, the ruin of a ruling regime. The Tokugawa clan, having finally unified Japan and brutally stamped out troublesome ideas like Christianity, must have felt pretty secure. They locked the doors, barred the windows, and put a giant "Do Not Disturb" sign on the whole country that would last for over 2 centuries. You have to admire the commitment. It's the kind of long-term planning you just don't see anymore. It turns out, however, that while you can stop new ideas from coming in, you can't stop the old ones from slowly going bad, like a forgotten tub of yogurt in the back of the national refrigerator. For nearly 700 years, Japan had been run by a military dictator called the Shogun, which literally translates to guy who runs everything. The emperor, meanwhile, was a divine figurehead in Kyoto, occupying a role somewhere between a god and a very well-respected but powerless grandfather. This whole arrangement was called the bakufu, or tent government, which sounds less like an iron-fisted military regime and more like what you'd call the operations hub for a large-scale camping festival. The last and most powerful of these tent governments was run by the Tokugawa, who came to power in 1603. To keep everyone in line, founder Tokugawa Ieyasu created a social system with 4 distinct classes: samurai warriors at the top, then farmers, artisans, and merchants. The idea was to create a society as stable and unchanging as a rock. The problem, as it often is, was money. The samurai were paid a fixed salary in rice, which worked fine until the economy modernized. Soon the merchants, the official losers of the social lottery, were swimming in cash, while many of the noble samurai were broke, forced to maintain the appearance of lethal dignity, while secretly hoping no one noticed their sword was a convincing fake made of bamboo. This glorious engineered stability was kept afloat by a strict isolation policy. After a peasant rebellion with strong Christian overtones convinced the shogunate that foreigners were more trouble than they were worth, Japan effectively hung up on the rest of the world. This worked for a while, but it also meant that while Europe was having its industrial revolution, Japan was perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. It was a peaceful time, but technologically the country was falling asleep at the wheel. Then, in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships showed up. This was less a friendly visit, and more the 19th century equivalent of an alien fleet parking over the White House lawn. The steam-powered American warships, belching smoke and bristling with cannons, made Japan's coastal defenses look like a child's sandcastle. The shogun, unable to shoo them away, was forced to sign treaties that opened the country to foreign trade. Suddenly, the man who was supposed to protect Japan from all threats was exposed as being completely incapable of doing so. His authority crumbled faster than a wet rice cracker. This humiliation lit a fuse. Powerful domains in the West, particularly Satsuma and Choshu, saw their chance. Fueled by a mix of genuine nationalism and good old-fashioned opportunism, they rallied behind the cry to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. They weren't just angry about the foreigners, they were tired of a government that had become economically backward and militarily weak. The whole anti-shogun movement culminated in 1868, when the last Tokugawa shogun just gave up, abdicated, and went into a quiet retirement. Power was restored to the emperor, kicking off the Meiji Restoration and a period of modernization so rapid it would give you whiplash. What became of the samurai, the warrior class that had defined Japan for centuries? The new government, in its rush to build a modern conscripted army, effectively fired them all. Their rice stipends were abolished, and they were forbidden from wearing their 2 swords in public, which for a samurai was like telling a modern consultant they can no longer wear a Bluetooth headset. The final tragic postscript came with the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori. He was a hero of the Restoration who became disillusioned when the new government rejected his plan to give the legions of unemployed samurai a purpose by, of all things, invading Korea. It was perhaps the most samurai solution to a problem ever proposed, and its failure marked the true end of their world. The age of the warrior was over, replaced by the age of the bureaucrat. The temple where the gods smile. In his book on Japanese aesthetics, In Praise of Shadows, Junichiro Tanizaki argues that beauty is found not in the thing itself, but in the shadows, the light and the darkness that one thing against another creates. He probably wasn't thinking of the shadow cast by a selfie stick, but the principle holds. After walking through centuries of shogunal history, where power was held by military leaders while emperors remained symbolic figures, visiting a temple defined by its imperial connections felt like a logical next step. Hōsen-in, in the quiet village of Ōhara, is a Monzeki temple, which means its head abbots were historically members of the imperial family. It has an air of secluded rustic elegance. This made the scene in the main hall especially jarring. The place was overrun with aspiring influencers, young women in rented kimonos engaged in what looked like the most stressful photo shoots imaginable. They were flanked by boyfriends or hired photographers who held reflectors with the grim focus of air traffic controllers. Each pose was a high-stakes performance for an unseen digital audience. We were there for a simpler, purer reason. My son believed a rare Pokémon was hiding behind a stone lantern. In a place built on subtle beauty, his quest for a cartoon monster felt, by comparison, almost noble. We started in the Shuheki-en garden, a classic viewing garden meant to be appreciated from the tatami floors of the guest hall. But it was impossible to appreciate much of anything while sidestepping a tripod that seemed to have more legal rights than I did. I made the decision to abandon the main viewing area and its population of wannabe catalogue models. We pushed deeper into the complex, following the signs for the Yusei-en garden. This was the right call. The atmosphere changed instantly. We entered a world carpeted in dozens of varieties of moss, a rolling landscape of deep green under a canopy of giant cedar trees. A small stream cut through the grounds, its gurgle the only sound besides the distant, frantic clicking of cameras. Dotted through this ocean of green were the temple's most famous residents, the Warabe Jizo. These are small stone statues of the Jizo Bodhisattva, the protector of children, but they are carved to look like children themselves. Each one has a different, cheerful face. Some are half sunk in the moss, as if peeking out from a nap. Others huddle together, sharing a stony secret. Their joyful, serene expressions were a direct antidote to the forced smiles we had just left behind. Under the towering cedar trees we found small, smiling statues. In the small, smiling statues we found the reason we had come. Mossy meditation, a misguided meander to McDonald's. The cheerful stone children scattered through the moss garden at Hōsen-in have a lot to smile about, which is odd when you consider their job description. These are the Warabe Jizo, pint-sized statues of a Buddhist protector who, by all appearances, is having a spectacular day. But behind those smiles is a profoundly grim line of work. Jizo is the guardian of travelers and, more pointedly, the savior of children who have died. It's a sad, necessary role that turns these happy-looking stones into figures of deep comfort for grieving parents who leave offerings of bibs and toys at their feet. Jizo's primary duties take place on the banks of the Sanzu River, the Japanese equivalent of the River Styx. Getting to the other side is not a simple ferry ride. It's a whole process. Your passage is determined by your accumulated karma, a system that sounds suspiciously like airport security for the afterlife. Virtuous souls get the express lane, a golden bridge. Those of us with a more balanced portfolio of deeds have to wade through a shallow ford. The truly wicked get tossed into the deep end, a serpent-filled current that is the universe's way of making sure you miss your connecting flight to eternity. The worst part involves the children. Having died before they could build up sufficient good karma credits, they're stuck on the riverbank in a kind of spiritual limbo. There, they're forced to build small towers of pebbles as penance. Every night, demons, who apparently have nothing better to do with their immortality, come along and knock the towers over. It is Jizo who descends to this purgatory, shoos away the demons, and hides the children in the sleeves of his robes to carry them to safety. I felt a chill thinking about it, a coldness that had nothing to do with the cool, damp air of the cedar grove. Now, if you suspect this all sounds more like a particularly grim story than official scripture, you'd be right. The Sanzu River doesn't appear in the original Indian Buddhist texts. It's an import from China, which has its own tradition of an underworld river. It seems every culture gets the dismal ferryman it deserves. For many modern Japanese Buddhists, the river and its demons are powerful folklore, not doctrinal fact, in the same way most Christians view Dante's Inferno as a literary masterpiece, not a travel guide. The feeling, however, remains. Inside the temple's Oho Gokuraku-in hall, a golden Amida Buddha sits flanked by his attendants, a serene presence at the center of these quiet woods and heavy stories. All this talk of karmic journeys reminded me of our last attempt to get off this very mountain. Our karma, it turned out, was awful. We were stranded for an hour trying to get a taxi. We finally gave up, boarded a bus that promptly got us horribly lost, and by the time we found our way back, we were so hot and defeated that dinner was a grim bag of McDonald's. This time, our spiritual account must have been in the black. A taxi answered our hail immediately. As it pulled away, I wondered, had we really earned this, or did we just get lucky? A pilgrimage site for the children of the 8-bit era. Was it possible to burn through a year's supply of good travel karma on one lucky taxi ride? After our frictionless escape from the mountains of Ōhara, which had felt like winning a cosmic lottery, I suspected our spiritual bank account was deeply in the red. We decided to test this hypothesis with a pilgrimage to the newly opened Nintendo Museum in Uji, an event my son was awaiting with the kind of devotion usually reserved for religious relics. Our first stop was lunch at the train station, which in Japan is not the act of mild culinary self-harm, it is back home. You can find Michelin-starred quality food wedged between a ticket machine and the Shinkansen platform. We found a promising spot where the food was, in fact, excellent. My son, however, received a little something extra. At the bottom of his miso soup, hiding like a deep-sea stowaway, was a small bundle of tiny clams. It was an unadvertised aquatic bonus feature, the kind of prize that usually comes with a frantic, pantomimed trip to an urgent care clinic. Fortunately, as part of our travel ritual, we had popped allergy pills beforehand, narrowly dodging a crustacean-based international incident. Fortified and de-shelled, we made our way to the museum. Architecturally, it is a monument to severe concrete and minimalist grandeur, designed by the famous Tadao Ando, the kind of building you construct to house either a priceless art collection or a doomsday weapon. My son was practically vibrating with excitement. Then we saw the sign, "No photography, except in a few designated selfie zones." I stared at the sign, then at the decades of video game history lining the halls. I had flown thousands of miles to tour the world's most enjoyable secret government facility. What did they think I was going to do? Steal the 30-year-old schematics for a prototype console and corner the market on failed 1980s technology? Denied the ability to document their famous hardware, I found myself examining the stranger corners of their past. The tour began with their origins as a maker of hanafuda playing cards, the type seen in old samurai films right before a table gets flipped. Then I saw it, sealed in a glass case like a piece of state's evidence, the N and B block, Nintendo's short-lived construction toy from the 1960s. To say it was a knockoff of Lego is an insult to knockoffs. The bricks looked like they'd been cloned from their Danish counterparts. It was a fascinating artifact from a time before Nintendo learned about international copyright law, a lesson they apparently took to heart, as they are now one of the most famously litigious companies on Earth. This was not even their strangest phase. Before Donkey Kong saved them, Nintendo was a company throwing ideas at a wall to see what would stick. They ran a taxi service, they sold instant rice. They even, for a glorious moment, operated a chain of love hotels, which are precisely what they sound like. The corporation that built its empire on family-friendly entertainment once specialized in renting rooms by the hour. It is a spectacular contradiction. The wholesome House of Mario, built on a foundation of gambling and hourly romance. After absorbing a century of corporate left turns, we headed to the museum cafe. The bill for our karmic debt had finally arrived, and it took the form of a hamburger. The bun, tragically drowned in soy sauce, had the structural integrity of a wet paper towel. It was less a meal and more a salty, beef-flavored sponge. As my son poked at the soggy wreck, I couldn't help but think of the $70 worth of perfect high-end sushi he'd ordered just days before. The universe, it seemed, was balancing its books. A sanctuary of privacy in a crowded world. My son's discovery of a hidden clam at the bottom of his miso soup was nothing compared to my own discovery that Nintendo, purveyor of family-friendly video games, once ran a chain of love hotels. The knowledge landed with the same gentle absurdity. It turns out the company's brief, failed detour into offering hourly room rentals was an attempt to tap into a uniquely Japanese solution to a universal problem, a desperate need for privacy. Love hotels are a fixture of the Japanese landscape, a practical answer to a chronic lack of personal space. In a country where multiple generations often share walls thinner than a politician's promise, these establishments provide a clean, safe, and anonymous space for couples to simply be alone. On one hand, it's a sober solution to a national housing reality. On the other hand, the solution might be decorated like a sci-fi spaceship where the minibar is stocked by a robot arm. This is where the Japanese genius for combining the intensely practical with the fantastically weird truly shines. Everything is engineered for discretion. You don't stroll into a grand lobby, you pull into a covered garage that hides your car. Check-in is often fully automated, a transaction as personal as buying a can of coffee from a vending machine. You stand before a glowing panel of available rooms, press a button for the medieval castle or jungle grotto, and proceed to your temporary fiefdom. Payment might be handled by a pneumatic tube, whisking your cash away as if it were a state secret, because, in a way, it is. The goal is zero human interaction. While these places are certainly used for the kind of activity that would make a soap opera writer blush, their main function is far more mundane. They are a sanctuary for married couples, a fun escape for dating partners, and a social pressure valve. Society has looked at human intimacy, decided it is a necessary part of life, and then regulated it with the same dispassionate logic used for waste management. The system provides a pragmatic outlet for private behavior as long as it doesn't disturb the public harmony. It's a brick-and-mortar manifestation of tatemae, the public face you show the world, and hon, your true private feelings. So what does the law have to say about an establishment designed for private hon? In the eyes of the government, a love hotel is not legally a hotel. It falls under the Businesses Affecting Public Morals Act, the same legislation that governs pachinko parlors and nightclubs. This means they are zoned away from schools and parks, clustered in entertainment districts or along highways, their existence acknowledged but kept separate from daily life. They are the public secret everyone knows but no one discusses. A sterile, automated, and occasionally pirate-themed solution to one of humanity's oldest needs. From the profound history of a blood-stained ceiling to the anticlimax of the Nintendo Museum, this chapter proves that travel karma is a very real and very finite resource. Join me next time as we head to Gifu, where rained-out castles lead to an unexpected discovery at an air and space museum built upon a complex military past. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon. Shinkansen and Sensibility. And if you want to come behind the scenes, get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. Until then, thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit.